Chapter 57, A Riddle Interlude Roman 3. Tom heaved a sigh as his Death Eaters filed out of the meeting. Narcissa sent him a pointed look before she flounced out of the room, and Tom's hand immediately froze where it had been scratching Eliza behind her ears. In his defense, she did make for quite a cute fox, her green eyes still the exact same shade when she peered up at him, and somehow the same smug sort of grin. That smile had always been quite fox-like. Tom sighed again, slouching further into his chair, unwilling to interrupt the silence or Eliza's soft, tiny snores. But he knew they didn't have time to waste. Shaking Eliza awake, Tom watched as she groggily stretched out before shifting back, not a hair out of place, as she perched herself on the table top. She swung her legs back and forth, and Tom had to suppress a smile at the sight of her ridiculously mismatched socks. "Only you, little star. Only you," he found himself saying, and smiled fondly when she rolled her eyes. He would love to just sit here and talk to her, just talk and talk about nothing. But there was a war out there that he intended to win, and he couldn't do that without knowing the machinations of a certain old man. Has Dumbledore spoken about anything regarding his futile Horcrux hunt to you yet? Merlin Dumbledore wasn't even here, and he was ruining Tom's conversations. He really couldn't wait to kill that old bastard. It wouldn't even surprise him if Dumbledore was immortal at this point, just so fate could continue to spite him and rob him of his satisfaction. So he's heading for the Gaunt house in Little Hangleton then. Eliza continued their conversation, and Tom nodded his head in thought. Dumbledore was already hunting his Horcruxes, which meant they had a year at most. If Tom was being honest within himself, his older self had not been especially crafty when it came to hiding their Horcruxes. Dumbledore would track down their previous locations easily, and when he found nothing, his suspicions would only grow. He could not place Eliza in such a precarious position. "The question is," Tom drawled, "what will he do next?" "Unless," Eliza cut in, fiddling with her fingers, "he doesn't find nothing." Tom watched curiously as she tapped her wand against her hand, dispelling some form of disillusionment charm, and slipped something off her finger. A ring, his ring. Perhaps a family heirloom would be more accurate, but Tom truly didn't view it as such. The Gaunts connected him to Slytherin, but beyond that Tom had no use for them, inbred maniacs that they were. But the ring was his. It was by far from the first thing he had stolen, but it was perhaps the first that truly meant something. That he belonged in this world, that he belonged to magic, and that nothing would ever take that from him. And Eliza had kept it all this time. "Of course I kept it, you moron. What else would I do with it?" She scoffed, and Tom could only blink in bafflement, not even moving away when her dainty, calloused hand reached out for his own. She had kept it. Kept something Tom had given her not because it was branded onto her, or unescapable, not because she needed it or wanted something. She could have even just stuffed it in a box somewhere, and yet she had kept it, sat on her hand all this time. Tom was only shaken out of his musings when the very ring he had been obsessing over, and it was the ring, not Eliza, seemed to change. The moment it left Eliza's hand, the once glimmering obsidian black became a dull slate gray. "Ignore the strange, mysterious stone for now," Eliza asked. "Ignoring the strange, mysterious stone for now," Tom echoed, and he could have left it at that. Instead, he reached over and instead grabbed Eliza's hand, holding it in his. She had looked after his ring all these years. It was only fair of her to keep it, really. "I don't know why I can't teach defense again," Barty complained sullenly, and Tom let out a sharp sigh. "Because you're meant to be dead, Barty. I was meant to be dead before. That didn't stop you last time." Nevertheless, Alexander cut in smoothly, and Tom felt his nose twitch. Alexander sounded like he was corralling a bunch of teenagers, although to be fair, Tom really couldn't blame him. He and Barty truly have spent too much time around Eliza. We already have plenty of eyes and ears at Hogwarts. It isn't imperative to get more of the staff on side. We should focus on gaining more support on the Wisengamot, Tom said, getting back on task. Amelia Bones wouldn't trust Lucius with a pygmy puff, but maybe they were interrupted when Tom's flue lit up behind them. Tom wasn't overly worried. The only person who had access to the Riddle Manor flue was Eliza, but it was a rather strange time for her to be visiting. A middle-aged, doddering woman stumbled out of the flue. She looked quite haggard, but the dazed look behind her eyes was a sure sign that she had been imperious. Eliza stepped out a moment later, looking the same as always, but Tom could tell there was something different, something wrong. It was the eyes. He realized somewhat belatedly as Eliza strode away. They looked so cold. Something detached in her gaze, empty and unfeeling. Even at her worst, her most angry, her most murderous even, Eliza Potter was always crackling with life. This somehow was wrong. "Are you not going to stop her?" Barty questioned, and Tom arched an eyebrow in his direction. A scream echoed through the room. She must have forgotten the silencing charm. Why would I deprive her of her fun? "Are you not going to check on her?" Alexander asked pointedly as Lucius simply sat gulping beside him, with none of the famed Malfoy decorum in sight. Another scream. "She seems to be doing fine," although he was worried. Something was wrong here with Eliza. Who was that woman, and what had she done to cause such anguish in his little star? What pain had she inflicted, and what could Tom do to bring his little star back to her usual self? Standing to his feet, Tom gestured towards the parlor door. "I'm sure you can show yourselves out, whilst I deal with the problem downstairs." The three men dithered slightly before they left, loitering in the doorway as they watched Tom with cautious eyes. It was surprisingly Lucius of all of them that spoke up first. "Please look after her." Tom didn't even get a chance to respond before they all practically ran away, much to his satisfaction. It wouldn't do for his followers to become too comfortable around him, even if they were a never-ending source of amusement. Turning on his heel, Tom drew his wand as he walked down into the cellar. He could smell the blood before he even reached the doors, hear the voices before he even thought to announce his presence. He heard enough to realize just who exactly Eliza was torturing in his cellar. "I was right about you, girl. You're nothing but a monster." And he heard enough to know he had to interfere. "Oh, sweetheart," he found himself saying as he stepped into the room, keeping Eliza in his peripheral. "You don't know what a monster is." Because Eliza was many things. She was brilliant, intelligent, quick-witted, an absolute pain in the arse and chaos incarnate. But she wasn't a monster. She never could be, at least not to him. Tom happily murdered the matron on Eliza's behalf, but the old woman wasn't the pressing issue. Eliza was staring blankly at the wall, wand held loosely in her hand. Tom never worried about much, never cared to worry about much truthfully, but this had him worried. "Eliza," Tom questioned, shaking her out of her reverie, "are you okay?" Tom hoped she would say yes. He had no idea what to do if she wasn't. He led her to the living room, spoke to her and held her, and tried to offer whatever comfort he could. Tom wasn't good at this, wasn't good with any of this, but Merlin Eliza deserved him to try. For everything he's done to her, all the chaos he brought into her life, he could at least offer her some comfort here and now, whatever form of peace he could bring to her. "Are you asking me out on a date, little star?" Tom teased after some time had passed, pulling her closer as she let out a considering hum. "And what if I am? For you, little star." He said anything, and for once, Tom wasn't lying. Tom wanted to take Eliza to the Ritz, to the Sky Garden. He wanted to take her to the most illustrious places London had to offer. But he knew Eliza, and he knew there was one place in London that would beat anything else in her mind. It was surprisingly easy work, getting private access to the Royal Observatory. One quick imperious, and the job was done. Although Tom thought he would have done anything just to see that awe-filled look on Eliza's face. He watched as she dashed around the abandoned planetarium with all the excitement of a child at Yule. She giggled madly as she dragged him along, pausing to point out any constellation she could spot. She even found his zodiac sign amongst the swathe of stars, and Tom listened to her ramble on indulgently. He didn't understand most of it. His knowledge on the advancements in Muggle science were only what he had gathered from background knowledge. But Eliza was happy, and that was enough. Surrounded as they were by galaxies and supernovas, Tom still couldn't help but think she was the brightest thing in the room. And back then, Eliza explained, keeping her gaze on the muggy London sky above them, as if she could see something he couldn't, "When I was still scared and alone with nothing but this giant urge to prove myself, I swore that one day even the stars themselves would remember me. They already do." The words were on the tip of his tongue, but Tom swallowed them back, kept them trapped in his lungs and behind his mouth and hidden away. "Have a good year at Hogwarts," he said instead, but it wasn't what he wanted to say, wasn't what he meant. But for now at least it was enough. It had to be. Tom paused in the doorway of his kitchen as he watched in horrified fascination as Severus downed his third mug of black coffee. Lucius was sat at the table with a concerned expression, and Tom briefly wondered where Narcissa was before realizing she would be having a catch-up with Bellatrix. Merlin helped Lucius. Narcissa was the only competent one even on a good day. "That is my coffee you're plundering," Tom commented dryly, and felt a flash of amusement when Severus didn't even pause, finishing the mug before he turned to look at Tom. "And I'm your spy. I deserve the coffee." Was it because Tom looked younger now? Or did all of his followers finally give up on their will to live? Perhaps it was a combination. Tom shrugged in a fair enough motion and took a seat at the kitchen table across from Lucius. It wasn't uncommon to find his followers wondering about his old manor house. Tom's private wing was warded against anyone who wasn't Eliza, but the rest of the house was a base of sorts. Lucius had offered up Malfoy Manor, but in good conscience Tom had refused. Baby Malfoy wouldn't be able to handle it, even if it would have been remarkably amusing. "What brings you both here today?" Tom asked, flicking his wand absently to make himself a cup of coffee as well. "Eliza," the pair said in unison, and Tom let out a soft sigh. He could be taking over magical Britain right now. That was what their plans were meant to be. Instead, he was here, suffering, because Eliza was a hazard to society. Not that he minded, really. Scrimgeour tried to confiscate the Time Turner offer. I had to pull a few strings, which means sadly Selwyn will not be putting forward the review on illegal potions, ingredients this month. "What did you do to Selwyn?" Tom asked, hoping he didn't sound as stressed as he felt. Lucius let out a despairing sigh, a defeated look entering his eyes. Surprisingly, he's a man who doesn't particularly care for bribery. Severus let out a surprised hum in the corner. Tom shared his sentiments. It was a rare thing indeed to find a decent politician. Tom turned his attention onto Severus, who had finally stopped downing coffee and rose and inquiring an eyebrow. "Eliza has started having lessons with Dumbledore, and I know," Tom cut in calmly, enjoying the shocked look that appeared on the usually put-together man's face. "You know." "Obviously," Tom drawled, "Dumbledore's days are numbered, Severus. Trust in me, and it will all be fine." "It's not you I'm worried about, my lord," Severus pointed out, and Tom inclined his head in acknowledgement. Eliza Potter was a wild thing. It was hard to predict what she would do next or what trouble she would cause. But at least life would never be boring, not when she was around. Tom watched as the Thistral trotted down Tower Bridge. Eliza sat astride it with a wide grin on her face as his followers flinched at the sight. Tom wondered why his Death Eaters seemed so wary of the Thistral. It wasn't as if any of them could claim they had no blood on their hands. Tom himself couldn't remember the first death he had ever seen. Perhaps those early days at the orphanage, or perhaps some time during the war. The collapsed buildings, rubble and ash and blood and screams Eliza, jumped off the Thistral, and Tom called out to her, a small smile growing on her face as they spoke back and forth. She was practically crackling with energy, itching for a fight, feelings Tom could share. It had been far too long since he had allowed himself to properly let loose. And so when the order finally arrived, Tom didn't hold back. He felt more than saw Eliza dart away from him, lunging right into the fight, and Tom joined her soon afterwards. He didn't waste any time playing with his opponents. He cut them down then and there. They tried to surround him on all sides, Dumbledore's poor cannon fodder, but Tom didn't let himself pause, didn't let himself stop moving for even a second. The Thames was lit up below them, Avada Green, as Tom tossed out unforgivable after unforgivable. The bodies fell at his feet and he moved on, a cutting hex, severing charm, protego, and repeat. The adrenaline was coursing through him as he joined the fray. He and Bellatrix dueled side by side as he tried to make his way towards Eliza at the other side of the bridge. He stepped over bodies and through puddles of blood, deflected and attacked as he battled his way through the masses until eventually there was no one left. Just him and the bloodied tarmac beneath his feet. Tom let out a deep breath, staring up at the flickering light of the lamppost as he decompressed after the fight. He sent most of his Death Eaters home with a lazy wave of his hand, the Lestrangers staying behind for clean-up. One step closer, he couldn't help but think gleefully as he tossed a body over the bridge and into the Thames below. Bit by bit he dismantled Dumbledore's army, his power, and bit by bit his control over wizarding Britain grew. And he knew just the person he wanted to share his victory with. Spinning on his heel, Tom immediately spotted Eliza, and it didn't take too long for him to realize something was wrong. She was pale, ghostly beneath the streetlight, and as Tom drew closer, he swore he could see blood coating her hands, too much blood as she clutched at her abdomen. He reached her just in time, catching her as she buckled, and Tom had never felt more scared in his life. Shards of glass were stuck in her abdomen, her hands warm and slippery with blood, her blood. He cursed to himself as he tried to move her in his arms, blind panic threatening to cloud his mind. He couldn't heal her here. He had no potions, no anything to help. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he had to keep her awake. He had to keep her awake, and he had to find Narcissa, and he had to keep her alive. Eliza. Tom called out to her, feeling the fear rise in him. Eliza, you need to stay awake, okay? You need to keep talking, he practically begged. He begged and he pleaded because he needed Eliza to be okay. He needed Eliza to be safe and alive, and Tom watched desperately as her eyes flickered open. He had never seen them so dull before, and when he saw the tears slipping down her face, he had to swallow a lump in his throat. He tried pressing his hands against the wounds, trying to stem the bleeding, and he flinched when he felt the blood against them. Blood had never bothered him before. He needed to get help. Eliza, he called again as she slumped in his arms, only this time she didn't wake up. She didn't even move. My lord. He heard someone call from behind him, but they were a distant thing. He couldn't focus on anything but Eliza in his arms. Eliza dying, he apparated them away without a second thought. Tom had never been very good at healing spells. He wondered if this is what Eliza had felt like in that cemetery, panicked and helpless and so utterly useless. He had mended her wounds as best as he could, pulled out the glass and stopped the bleeding. And now all he could do was wait. He still had her blood on his hands. He was coated in the stuff, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Couldn't bring himself to leave her side. He had almost lost her tonight. Tom had never felt anything like it. He hadn't felt such grief when he discovered what Voldemort had become, never felt such grief when his goals had been ruined and his ambitions had been stripped. He had never felt as much fear. Even when he had been cowering in filthy Muggle London, bombs dropping overhead, never before had he felt so terrified. Tom didn't know how long he spent sat there, holding her hand, checking her pulse. It felt like centuries. Every stuttered breath, every slight shift made his heart race. Logically, he knew he should call Narcissa. Narcissa was a trained healer. She could have done more to help than Tom. But he couldn't bring himself to take his eyes off her for even a second. Please, Tom whispered, pleaded, please wake up, because who was he, really who was he, without her by his side? Tom didn't deserve any miracles. If he was being honest, he probably didn't deserve a lot of things. He pleaded, and he begged whatever out there was willing to listen to him, that Eliza would wake up. He was meant to keep her fair. Steadfastly ignoring the burning in his eyes, Tom tightened his grip on Eliza's hand. Focused as he was on his own thoughts, he almost missed the slight squeeze of his hand he got in return. You look like shit, she choked out, voice hoarse and raspy, but there, and Tom felt near boneless with relief. He pushed water into her shaking hands and recounted what happened at her request. And when she tried to scramble out of bed to return to Hogwarts, Tom felt that now familiar panic seize him once again. You almost died, Tom said, clinging onto her hand, feeling her pulse hammer beneath his fingertips, every beat proving that she was in fact alive. I held you and you were crying, and you were bleeding, and you were dying. He ignored how strange his voice sounded. He hadn't cried in years, hadn't cried since he had been young Tom Riddle hoping for a family of his own in that old orphanage. Eliza was fine, she was here, she was safe, and she was alive. It was fine. He just didn't want her to leave so soon. Stay, he asked, studiously looking at the wall of his room before braving a glance towards her eyes. They looked tired, so very tired, but no longer dull. He thought Eliza's lifeless eyes were something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He watched as she buried herself beneath the duvet, curling up in herself as she quickly dropped off to sleep. Never again, he vowed, never again would she be hurt. He would protect Eliza Potter with his life. Master needs to go to sleep, Nagini bossed him about, fixing him with a judgmental stare as Tom shoved another piece of legislation aside. I'm too busy to sleep right now. Too stupid to sleep right now. Nagini shot back and coiled up further, evidently intending on giving him the silent treatment. Tom was just about to respond when the journal he had connected to Eliza's heated up, alerting him to a new message. Glancing at the time, Tom felt his curiosity rise. Eliza never usually spoke to him at this time, even if she was awake. Opening the journal, Tom blinked in surprise at the words Eliza had scrawled in. Tom, the messages began. Are you there? I know you don't sleep, so what are you doing? Politics, probably. I hope Nagini is bullying you. Anyway, the message cut off there, a jagged line of ink cutting across the page before Eliza's messy handwriting returned. Draco's bullying me, but I have something very important to say, okay? Okay. Very important business here. You have very pretty eyes. The messages stopped there, but Tom found himself laughing for some time after. Trust Eliza to cause trouble at her first Slug Club party. He remembered Severus mentioning it earlier now, and if Slughorn was anything like he was when they were younger, then he was still very liberal with his alcohol. Who knew Eliza could be so sweet? Baby Malfoy best look after her, or Tom would make him regret it. You have very pretty eyes, too, darling. Tom wrinkled his nose as he apparated in front of the ramshackle old mansion. As much as Tom wanted the vampires on his side, he could admit they did nothing to help themselves. Could they really get any more stereotypical than an abandoned mansion in the middle of nowhere? Tom strode to the front door, rapping his knuckles against the rotting wood even though he knew the vampires were perfectly aware of his presence anyway. One of Sanguini's henchmen swung the door open. Tom never bothered to learn their names and led him through the winding hallways of the old mansion. Sanguini sat at the head of the old dusty table, a wine glass full of blood in his hand, and all of the dramatics of Bram Stoker's Dracula as the vampire offered him a sharp smile. And so Lord Gaunt graces us with his presence, he exclaimed, pausing to take a sip of blood from the glass. What can we do for you today? Tom kept a blank expression on his face and still refused to take a seat at the table. He had climbed out of the gutter for a reason. He wasn't about to sit on a moldy, damp chair just for the sake of political mind games. I think you'll find it's more what I can do for you. Tom responded easily and pulled a rough outline of the Wisengamot bill from his blazer jacket, casually flicking it down the table towards Sanguini, who peered at it with badly concealed interest. You would think, Tom mused as he studied Sanguini, that after living for so long the vampire would be better at masking his reactions. Or perhaps he had lived long enough that he no longer cared anymore. And you believe this would pass? Sanguini questioned disbelievingly, and Tom barely stopped himself from rolling his eyes. I'd hardly be paying you a visit if I didn't, he shot back before internally scolding himself. He had been quicker to anger these days, rattled ever since the incident on Samhain, but that was no excuse to lose his cool. Right now it's illegal for vampires to feed directly from the vein, but it's also illegal for you to maintain blood through other means. I see no reason why most of the Wisengamot would refuse the idea of a blood drive, so to speak. Especially if participants get paid by the liter, Tom added, summoning the papers back to him. They'll want something from us. Of course they will, Tom answered breezily, shoving the papers back into his pocket. You know they do, and that's why you've agreed to work with me. Besides, Tom said, already planning on leaving the miserable hovel behind him, public sympathy will soon lie with the vampires after Eliza begins enacting whatever schemes she's planning. How long had she been planning something like the Insider? Tom knew when she finally began publishing, she wouldn't be doing anything by halves. Ah yes, Eliza, Sanguini practically purred, and something about his voice made Tom halt in his steps. I had the pleasure of meeting her at Slughorn's party, you know. He spoke conversationally, but there was a knowing glint in the vampire's eyes that made Tom tense. Might I say I can see why you want her by your side? She was delectable. Tom was over at Sanguini's side in an instant, jabbing his wand against the vampire's throat, who didn't even flinch away. You stay away from her, Tom practically hissed, feeling cold fury fill him as the challenging look never left Sanguini's face. Why? He questioned. Does she belong to you, Lord Gaunt? Eliza doesn't belong to anyone but herself. I just know that she'd have better taste than you. Tom shot back before placing his wand back in its holster, reining in his temper. If you know what's good for you, you'll keep far away from her. Tom warned one last time, and started striding for the door, trying to remind himself that it wasn't good practice to torture your political allies. "Never took you for the knight in shining armor type," Sanguini called after him just as Tom reached the doorway, and he paused, turning slightly to smirk at the vampire. "Believe me, if you hurt Eliza Potter, I'm the last person you should be worrying about, Dark Lord he may be," but Tom had nothing on a woman scorned. Another year, another Yule Ball. Tom couldn't wait until they started legalizing all their old traditions again. The Malfoy Yule Ball was spectacular, yes, but it wasn't as it used to be. Tom could still remember the awe he felt on his first proper Yule, when Orion had invited him to the Black Ancestral Manor for the holidays. Pure raw magic, an overwhelming sense of belonging, of home, as Tom for maybe the first time felt a semblance of peace. And to think Albus Dumbledore had the audacity to call such magic dark. Tom took another boring glance around the room before he caught sight of the devil herself, chatting to Narcissa across the room. Eliza had neglected to mention she would be attending this year's Yule Ball, but then again, Eliza never neglected an opportunity to cause chaos. Really, he should have been expecting this. "I thought we could put on a bit of a show," Eliza explained, mischief in her eyes as she turned to face him with that half-smile on her face that could only mean trouble. Often Tom found that the trouble was worth it. Still somewhat moping over the loss of swing music, Tom led Eliza around the room, exchanging quips and smiles as they danced. Tom could feel the crowd looking at them, and was somewhat aware of the reporters stood off by the side, thinking they were being discreet as they eyed their next article, but he found for once he didn't care about pandering. He wasn't thinking about their next plan or their next move. Eliza had a way of doing that. It was almost frightening, really, how easily she invaded his thoughts, how quickly she captured his attention. "I see you're still wearing my necklace, little star," Tom pointed out, noticing the glimmering crystals still clasped around her neck. "Aren't we supposed to be on the outs?" He had to suppress a grin when Eliza almost tripped over her own feet when he span her around, pressing her close against him as she spoke. "I guess I've become quite attached." "It is quite a beautiful necklace," Tom acknowledged, although privately he thought Eliza to be far more beautiful. "I wasn't talking about the necklace." For the first time in years, Tom stumbled as he and Eliza began dancing again. Eyes wide, he watched Eliza smirk smugly and couldn't help but feel just a tiny bit flustered. Tom Riddle did not do flustered, but as always Eliza was the exception. Tom eyed the bottle of fire whiskey on his shelf, speculatively, before heaving a sigh and returning to the latest Wisengamot bill. Riddle Manor was empty for once. The Lestranges had gone over to Malfoy Manor, and Barty had run away to presumably pester Severus, until the grouchy potions master agreed to go on a night out, which left Tom on his own with only Nagini for company. Not that he minded, although he could do without the side of political hell he had been gifted with for his birthday. Who cared about the speed limits of the newest broomsticks? If Quidditch nuts wanted to catapult themselves to the moon, then they could. Tom would find a way to profit from it somehow. "Please tell me you're not actually doing politics on your birthday. What else would he be doing? Sleeping? Unlikely. Drinking? Very possibly, but Nagini always hated it when he wallowed alone. He supposed he should actually start searching for a proper house at some point, really. Riddle Manor was more of a base than a home, but house hunting at this time was a bit ridiculous even for Wait. Little star, what are you doing here?" He hadn't expected to see her tonight, believed her to be with her godfather, and the Malfoys causing trouble somewhere else. Not here, with him, and certainly not bringing him food from his favorite restaurant to celebrate his birthday. "How did you even get all this?" Tom asked later as the pair of them set the table. Eliza grinned, pulling out carefully boxed containers of food. "Good old-fashioned bribery. Call it a donation to the poor underpaid staff. What a good Samaritan you are," Tom commented dryly as Eliza pulled out a bottle of wine. "As if I would resort to a subpar bribery," Eliza said, jokingly offended as Tom summoned a wine glass from the kitchen alongside a bottle of butterbeer. "Those staff members will be thanking me right now. Anyone working in customer service would have cried over an extra quid at this point. Is the trauma coming back to you, Tom?" Eliza teased, placing a bowl of calamari in the middle of the table. "Did working in Borgin and Burke's make you cry?" "Every day," Tom deadpanned, and Eliza let out a peal of laughter before taking her seat, uncorking her butter beer in one smooth, well-practiced motion. See then, you can't judge my bribery when you would have killed for a good Samaritan yourself. And then, not for the first time, Tom wondered what would have happened if he had known Eliza back then. Would he have noticed her if she had walked into Borgin and Burke's? Would he have spotted her, spoken to her, noticed her quick wit and pretty eyes, and that smile that told everyone she just knew something you didn't? He wouldn't put it past her to bribe him actually, or try a quick sleight of hand. And he would have been interested, no doubt. Maybe they would start chatting, maybe they would grab a coffee. Maybe Tom would have stayed in London, and maybe he would never have made that next Horcrux, and maybe he would have gotten that defense job. Or what if they had gone to Hogwarts together? What if they had met each other, children, friendless, cold and broken, and closed off from everything and everyone? And what if they had changed that together? They could have ruled the house together, taken the whole of Hogwarts by storm. And when Tom succumbed to his petty revenge, Eliza would have been there with her never-ending love of mischief to back him up. What if, what if, what if? So Tom Riddle, Eliza murmured, eyes burning bright in the candlelight. What do you want? What if I kissed you right now? And then they were, almost desperately, as Tom tried to convince himself that they were different people in different circumstances. Tom kissed her and tangled his hands in her hair and pulled her closer to him as the what-ifs pounded like a drum in his mind. What if there was no war? What if he wasn't a Dark Lord? What if he hadn't killed Eliza's parents? You didn't answer my question, she breathed out as they parted, cheeks flushed and lips swollen as Tom gripped her tighter, went back to kissing her so he could ignore the thoughts in his mind. What if she deserved more than him? What do you want, Tom? Eliza demanded, pulling away from him with a hard set to her jaw, an indiscernible look in her eyes, and Tom found that for once he couldn't say anything at all. Happy birthday, Tom, Eliza wished softly as Tom watched her walk away. She disappeared into the flue without looking back, and Tom turned to the still-lit candle in front of him, heart pounding. He wanted Albus Dumbledore dead, wizarding Britain under his rule. He wanted to be remembered and immortalized. And he wanted Eliza. He wanted her to be happy, and he wanted her to live her own life. And she couldn't do that if she was with him. But what if she could? Tom blew out the candle. It was the what-ifs, Tom found, that were the real killers for people like him. She had to have done this on purpose. Tom stared down at the paper in front of him, the Did You Know section of this Monday's issue of The Insider. Eliza had printed a new research article debunking the theories behind Amortentia. A wide misconception is the belief that children born under the influence of this potion are incapable of love. Tom didn't want to believe it at first. He scoffed and snarked and rolled his eyes, but he kept reading the article over and over again. Because Eliza had published this, which meant even though he had his misgivings, it was more likely than not true. And Eliza had never led him wrong before. Eliza who believed in him. Eliza who taught him the Patronus. Eliza who had always said she didn't think he was incapable of love. But just because he may be capable of feeling such a thing didn't necessarily mean he had. He cared for things, found satisfaction and brief flashes of happiness, but love was a completely different beast. What was love anyway? Who decided that? Who knew? Master seems troubled, Nagini said from a spot on his shoulders, coiled around him like a particularly bossy scarf. Tom had treated her to a rabbit, and all day she had been lazily slumped over his shoulders, practically refusing to move. Tom let out an acknowledging hum and ran his hand over her head absently as he reread the paper. What do you think about Eliza? Tom asked the snake, flipping through the rest of the paper's pages idly. The little speaker, Nagini replied, slithering down from his neck so she could look him in the eyes, as Master finally realized his feelings. She would be a worthy mate, Tom sighed. Nagini and Jormy were both the same, assuming that it was all just that obvious. But how can you know Nagini? How do you know if you're in love? He felt Nagini pause in her restless movements and watched as she seemed to flick her tongue out in consideration. I have always tried to offer you my counsel, Master, but there are some questions that are beyond me. You have reached a point, Master, like all hatchlings do, where you have outgrown the need for a snake's wisdom. Tom heaved another sigh, holding Nagini closer to him. Pushing the paper away from him, Tom instead placed down a glass in front of him. Filling up the glass with fire whiskey, Tom tossed it back in once before filling it up again. Because that's what you did when everything you thought you knew was pulled out from underneath you. You drank. Tom stumbled as he drunkenly apparated into Malfoy Manor. At first, he had only wanted to come here for some expensive wine, because Merlin knows Lucius had enough of the stuff, but then he realized he could kill two birds with one stone. "My lord," Lucius questioned, highly confused when Tom rapped on his office door. Tom waved his hand lazily and practically threw himself onto the chair opposite Lucius. "Not tonight," Tom responded easily, and carelessly summoned the bottle of Ogden's Lucius thought he had sneakily hidden behind his desk. Tom took a swig of it before offering a bit to Lucius, who gave one slow shake of his head, an extremely befuddled look still on his face. "How can I help you, my lord?" Lucius asked, and Tom heaved a giant sigh. How could Lucius help him? Tom couldn't go to Severus with any of his issues. He couldn't be that cruel. He could not approach Bella or Barty, and he certainly wasn't going to go to Alexander. The man would be insufferable if he discovered Tom absolutely hammered on his doorstep. At least Lucius still had a healthy dose of fear left in him when it came to his interactions with Tom. Plus, Lucius, how do you know you're in love? Lucius blinked heavily across from him, a blank look on his face as he looked at Tom across the table. When Tom didn't let up his unwavering gaze, Lucius let out a choked sort of hysterical laugh before summoning a drink for himself. "Merlin, please don't let me remember this in the morning." And with that, he uncorked the bottle. Narcissa found them a few hours later, still in Lucius' office, but considerably drunker than they had both been when the night began. "I leave you alone for an hour," Narcissa said, raising her eyebrows as she took in the sight of the many empty bottles stacked across the desk. "In my defense," Lucius said, "it was multiple hours." Tom blinked in surprise when Narcissa suddenly appeared next to him. He hadn't even noticed her move. Did she turn invisible? "Malfoy," he greeted when he noticed her staring at him, because the least he could do was be polite. "Merlin, damn it," and he saw as her eyebrows seemed to impossibly rise further. "Why is she Lady Malfoy? But I'm Lucius." Lucius whined across from him, but Tom simply let out a vague hum, waving his hand in a sort of all-encompassing gesture to convey that it was simply obvious. He almost knocked his glass over and frowned in confusion at it. He swore he hadn't left it there. Had it moved by itself? "You're a good lawyer, Lucius, but Narcissa could kill me and they wouldn't find my body. That's the difference." A sort of deafening silence followed that proclamation, and Tom decided to down the rest of his drink before the glass decided to move itself again. "Why is there a drunk Dark Lord in the office, Lucius?" Narcissa asked, and Tom let out a snort. "Merlin, he was quite drunk, wasn't he? He couldn't remember being this bad since that time in New Orleans. Had it been New Orleans? There was that incident with the statue, wasn't there? Oh well. He would just kill the Malfoys in the morning, then they wouldn't remember either. Or he could obliviate them. Eliza would probably prefer it if he obliviated them. He'd do it now and leave, but there was the small issue of his wand. Or more the issue that he couldn't recall where it was. But Tom wasn't worried. There were glass bottles on the desk. He could easily turn one into a weapon if it came down to it. The Dark Lord was having an existential crisis, Lucius pointed out, and Tom nodded his head in agreement, sneakily pouring himself some more whiskey. "And your solution was to get him drunk?" Narcissa drawled out questioningly, and Lucius let out a sound of protest. "In Lucius' defense, I was already quite drunk when I arrived," Tom pointed out, sipping the drink in front of him when Narcissa turned to face him again as she rested a hand on Lucius' shoulder at the other side of the desk. Lucius had better liquor than Tom did. That wasn't fair in his opinion. "And what brought you to us in such a state, my lord?" Narcissa said curiously, and Tom slumped further into his seat, mind retreating to what had brought him here in the first place. "I had a question I was hoping Lucius would be able to answer," Tom said, curiously feeling the drunken haze he was in before slowly leave his mind. "But it seems I was mistaken. And what question might that be?" Narcissa responded evenly, and it was then Tom noticed she had swapped out his glass of whiskey for a sobering potion. Smirking slightly at the bold actions of the Malfoy, Tom down the rest of the potion, shaking his head slightly as he gathered himself. "What is love?" he asked again, now completely sober. No excuse for the vulnerability he was about to show, no fallback to depend on. But he needed to know. He needed to know more than he had needed to know anything in his whole life. "Because according to Eliza's article, I am apparently fully capable of feeling such an emotion." But how do I know what it is? How does one even tell? Tom mused, ignoring the glances Lucius and Narcissa were sending each other. Muggles believe love can be broke down to chemicals in the brain. Others say it's a thing of fairy tales, something you just know. But I don't, Tom said, voice empty. I don't know. A silence fell over them for a while, and Tom tried to ignore the way he had confessed his vulnerabilities so openly. It wasn't in his nature. He knew it wasn't, but once again, Eliza had a way of changing everything. Alexander, Severus, the Malfoys, they were the closest things Tom could ever have to friends. He could admit he somewhat cared for them, that at some point over the years they had become something more than simple commodities. At some point over the years, Tom himself had began to change. And so he needed to know now if he was truly in love with Eliza Potter, because that would be the biggest change of them all. Eventually, it was Narcissa who broke the silence. I'm sure you've heard Dumbledore's preachings time and time again. She began drolly, and Tom snorted sardonically. If the old man ever found out about the crisis Tom was going through, he was sure he'd have a heart attack on the spot, about love and family and friendship, and how it's an unbreakable bond, an unshakable feeling. But it's something else, too. Love, more than anything, is a choice, Narcissa said seriously, and Tom had to resist the urge to shuffle in his seat. He was a Dark Lord, had done things most wizards couldn't even comprehend, but Narcissa Malfoy was terrifying. I chose to love Lucius. I chose him in the face of our family's wrath. I chose him in spite of all his faults. I chose him because of them. I chose to love him today, and I will tomorrow, and the day after that. I chose to marry him, to start a family with him. I would burn down the world for him, Narcissa explained, never taking her eyes off Lucius as she spoke. Hands clutching his, and Tom felt something odd twist inside of him at the sight. It's not something that just happens, Lucius continued. I could say I fell in love with Narcissa overnight, but I didn't. Instead, I choose to love her every single day. I choose to wake up next to her every morning, sleep next to her every night. I love this woman because she makes me happy, because I want her to be happy. We can't tell you what love is, my lord, Narcissa ended, finally looking back at Tom across the table before her lips curled into a small, mischievous smile. But if you choose to love Eliza, even if you have no idea what that would look like, that's enough. She deserves better, Tom said in response, skirting around the issue, and Narcissa inclined her head. She doesn't want better, she wants you, Narcissa said. He had killed people for less, and yet he didn't even find himself reaching for his wand, which turned out to be in his pocket all along. The Malfoys were trusted. They were a refuge, something Tom had never had before Eliza. It was an odd feeling, but not an unwanted one. I suppose the real question here, my lord, is not are you capable of love, but do you want to be? Tom didn't answer the question. He didn't think they expected him to, and in all honesty, he didn't think he could give an answer right now, even if he tried. If this ever leaves this room, Tom threatened mildly as he rose to his feet, intending to leave and still feeling vaguely embarrassed over his drunken breakdown. You could just say thank you, Lucius commented dryly, still very much drunk, and Tom shot a mild, stinging hex in retaliation, sweeping out of the office door. The next day the Malfoys received a rather generous donation, and coincidentally, their main business rival in France had mysteriously disappeared, leaving all of his stock up for grabs to the highest bidder. It was the closest to a thank you that they would get. Move away, Tom, Dumbledore ordered, wand aimed at him over Eliza's shoulder, who had frozen in Tom's arms. Move away now. And why would I do that? Tom couldn't help but respond, antagonizing the man further as the panic grew in his eyes. As if Dumbledore could hold any authority over him, those days were far behind them. He felt Eliza shift beneath him restlessly as the conversation proceeded. He knew she never usually had time for his theatrics, but Tom was determined to take his time. He wanted to see the betrayal on Dumbledore's face, wanted to witness his pain, wanted to make his empire crumble. What do you want, Tom? Dumbledore questioned, although it somehow still sounded like a demand, as the old man stubbornly clung onto his pride even now, so close to the end. Of course, Dumbledore still probably thought he was making it out of this alive. Tom would ensure that he wouldn't. Take the potion, Tom ordered, and adjusted his wand so it was pointed towards Eliza's throat, who had become oddly still. her gaze fixed unblinkingly on Dumbledore as he hesitated. Or I kill her. Tom couldn't say he was surprised when Dumbledore made no move to take the potion. He had wondered if the man would sacrifice himself, but Tom knew men like Dumbledore. They were the chess master, and they would always value themselves over their pawns. Perhaps he would have drank it if Tom had never showed up. Perhaps he would have extended Eliza's life by a few measly years. But Tom hadn't been willing to take that risk or miss the opportunity, not when he could finally end things here and now. The girl who lived, sacrificed by the almighty Dumbledore, Tom drawled out and discreetly withdrew his arms from around Eliza. It was only fair that she got to take part in the dramatics. It was thanks to her that they had even reached this point after all. Or at least, that's how the story would have gone, she chimed in, and Tom felt a grin cross his face as she continued, as the confusion flickered across Dumbledore's face, and he couldn't help but laugh when the betrayal finally set in. Feeling a flash of satisfaction, Tom span his wand idly in his hand one last time. Crucio he cast, and the duel began in earnest. Tom could feel the adrenaline coursing through him. It had been a long time since he'd had a proper duel, not counting Eliza. And Dumbledore wasn't holding back, at least not against him. The old man was shooting to kill as they traded curses and hexes at an almost alarming speed. Tom could barely judge which way the next attack was coming, relying on his instincts as he dodged and deflected Dumbledore's never-ending barrage of spells. And then the tide started shifting as Eliza finally joined in the fray. Tom still couldn't get over how easy it was to duel with Eliza, how seamlessly they fit together as they both backed Dumbledore into a corner. The old man was distracted, still not wanting to hurt his precious student, and Tom capitalized on that, gaining more ground as Dumbledore's defense grew sloppy. Tom cursed, stumbling back as roaring orange flame appeared out of nowhere, cutting through the gap between him and Eliza. Wincing slightly at the flames scorching his skin, even beneath his robes, Tom picked back up the fight alone, hoping Eliza was okay on the other side of the wall of flames. Dumbledore had slowed down their duel, too busy preaching to return to their former ceaseless pace, but Tom let him. It felt almost wrong to continue without Eliza, not when they had come so far. Maybe it was because the girl in question seemed to always be on his mind that Tom noticed her first. She stepped through a gap in the fire, flame reflecting in her green eyes as she stepped forward. Tom was immediately reminded of the first task, when she had walked through dragonfire and came out the other side. Dumbledore would not stand a chance against them. And just as Tom predicted, Dumbledore fell down before them. For so long he had been a source of Tom's hatred, a figure of the war, of all that stood in the way between Tom and his desires, the satisfaction he had been chasing. And now he lay at their feet, just a man who had made his choices and his mistakes in equal parts. A man who had wronged him, yes, but he wasn't as much of a villain as Tom himself was. But Eliza had almost been sacrificed by Dumbledore's schemes, and Eliza was far more precious, much better of a person than Tom could ever hope to be. For Tom this was a victory, far more than vengeance. "Do you want the honors, little star?" Eliza snapped her head to look at him, shock painted on her face, and Tom had to suppress a smile when she almost dropped Dumbledore's wand in surprise. And Tom returned her shock when he felt her small hand come to grip his, warm and steady as she looked at him. Turning away, Tom raised his wand against Dumbledore, tightening his grip on her hand in the process. Avada Kedavra, the war was won, and they had ended it just as they had begun. Together. Tom span Eliza around, holding her close to him as she laughed merrily, the world lying at their feet. Love, more than anything, is a choice, and Tom knew now, looking at her as she smiled up at him, brilliant in a way that no one else could ever compare to, that he would choose Eliza. He would choose her time and time again, and hopefully that would be enough. "What next?" Tom quipped, returning Eliza's wide smile. Tom couldn't wait to find out.